She said no strings attached, but I think she lied. This post is an update of what happened after my accident. For anyone curious how I ended up here, I would highly suggest reading part 1 first. However, you can also just pick up here and return to part 1 afterwards if you are interested. I woke up in darkness, unsure where I was. My body felt stiff, my chest tightening with each breath like something was constricting me. A coarse blanket weighed over me, suffocating in its own way. Even my arms felt heavy, pinned down by strings anchored into my vein. I was wrapped in a cocoon I couldn't escape. My neck was squeezed too tightly to take in enough air, and my breaths came in shallow bursts. I was a fly caught in a web. One by one, my senses returned. The soft hum of machines filled the silence, the sharp scent of antiseptic cutting through the haze. The room swam in and out of focus. It wasn't a web, it was a hospital bed. But even as the confusion faded, the feeling of being trapped didn't. I tried to move, but a sudden pain flared through my neck, the brace holding me still. I laid there awake for hours, hopeless. It wasn't until one of the nurses carefully turned me over to my side that I saw the bundle of flowers next to a bottle of whiskey. It was the same flowers from where I first picked up Moira. I knew it was from her. I don't recall much of our small talk leading up to the cliff, but I remember mentioning I was a whiskey guy. The faint memory gave me hope. I knew she was the one who had saved me from a watery grave. The only person who visited me was Joshua. I expected a friendly greeting, but all I got was an earful about how reckless I'd been. After an hour of "I told you so," he finally relented and asked about the rest of the date. I told him everything I could remember. To me, the events had happened only a few hours ago, but apparently, I'd been in the hospital for a week before even waking up. And on top of that, another 3 days had passed before I was able to write anything down. Sorry you guys got the watered-down version of the events in part 1. The realization didn't hit me in the way you would think. I wasn't concerned about the time I lost. The only thought on my mind was if she still remembered me, if she still cared enough to see me again. In my current predicament, strung up in a hospital bed, I thought my chances with Moira were over. Desperate for any sort of way to communicate with her, I begged Joshua to bring my laptop to the hospital. He reluctantly agreed, but not before imparting more of his wisdom. I was growing sick of it. He paced up and down the hospital room, waving his hands like a preacher delivering a sermon. I don't like this. Look at you, look at where this Moira girl got you. You should be happy you're alive, man. If you keep pushing, I don't know how much more you can take. If you want my advice, just cut ties with her. And I cut him off before he could finish. You don't even know her. How could you blame her for this? How can you point fingers when it was your advice that led to all of this? I spoke harshly, aware of how defensive I was being. My words felt strange. Arguing with Joshua was something I'd never done before. We had never even disagreed on anything. This was the first time I pushed back instead of just going along with what he suggested. His calm response caught me off guard. I do know her. His voice didn't sound convinced of the words it carried. We briefly met at the hospital after your accident. We exchanged numbers. She asked me to let her know when you woke up. He hesitated, his uncertainty deepening. There was something off about her, man. Her eyes, they were colder and more aged than in her pictures. Did you let her know? I asked eagerly. His tone softened, shifting from ignorance to compassion. This was the Joshua I knew. Not yet. I'll let her know tonight, and I'll bring you your laptop tomorrow. I can see this is important to you. I'm sorry you think this is my fault. With a slight grin, he continued, but hey, at least you're out of the house. His twisted sense of humor almost made me chuckle, if only the pain would allow it. The next day couldn't come fast enough. The hope of seeing Moira again was all I could think about. In a misguided attempt to make the night pass quicker, I asked the nurses for more sedatives. I'm not sure what they gave me, but the effects were immediate. It was like I was pulled into a deep sleep, one I'd never known before. If only they'd warned me about the side effects. That night, I had a nightmare brought on by whatever the nurses gave me. I was still trapped in the hospital in the same room. But now, everything was shrouded in darkness. I awoke even slower than before, my senses muffled and distant. But I knew there was someone in the room with me, an old woman. I couldn't quite place her at first. The figure was small and frail, her presence oddly familiar, yet foreign. I thought it might be my grandmother, But then I remembered she died years ago. The woman knew I was awake and stood up from her chair. She quietly walked over to me and placed her hand on my face. It was cold, but as it pressed against my face, I felt a strange warmth, as if the touch was meant to comfort me. She leaned in closer, her breath cold against my ear. Then, in a voice soft yet chilling, she whispered, "Just point me to your pain, and I will do the rest. I'll clean you of this mess. In trade, I will request the recesses of your mind, of which I'll weave my nest." The words were cold and ominous, their implications comforting at first, and at the same time, terrifying. Yet they were spoken as kindly as a lullaby, guiding me back to sleep. My laptop arrived the next morning, and with it the painful acceptance that my body was still too weak to make use of it. My message to Moira would have to wait. I spent the next 2 days trapped in my own thoughts, barely able to move. On the third day of waiting for Moira to visit, I finally caved. Ignoring the doctor's advice, I convinced a nurse to help me set up my laptop. I needed to write her something just to show I was alive. Once I booted up my laptop, I was met with the last page I had visited before our date. The nurse looked at me funny as I tried to suppress my laughter. There, in bold letters, right above 5 glowing stars, I realized why the diner owner's name sounded familiar. Not wanting to dwell on our first date any longer, I closed the page and opened Moira's messages. No new messages. In fact, it looked like Moira hadn't been online for the past week. My heart sank knowing she hadn't written me, but at least she wasn't online looking for someone else. I sent her a pretty desperate and way too long message that she hasn't replied to yet. So I won't repeat it here, for my own sake and for whoever ends up reading this. With nothing else to do between physical therapy and doctor's visits, I decided to write down my experience so far. Mostly as a mental exercise to try and remember what happened, and to serve as a warning to myself and anyone else planning to go hiking on their first date. Since I woke up, it took me almost another week of writing, but I'm finally all caught up. I know that seems slow, but between piecing together my memories and then painfully writing them down, I think I did okay. And just in time, too. I'm finally getting released today. Joshua is picking me up in my car. He gave Moira my address so she could leave my car there. She didn't know what else to do with it after driving me to the hospital that day, the day I spent so long trying to recall. The next thing I write should be from the comfort of my own home. I should feel relieved, but I can't shake this strange, lingering feeling. Like there's something I'm forgetting, but I can't quite place my finger on. My first night back was worse than anything I've ever experienced. Not even the creepy old lady at the hospital can compare to what happened last night. Let me preface this by saying I don't usually have a nightcap before bed, but last night I made an exception. When I got home and unpacked my things, I found the bouquet of dead flowers that served as a reminder of my relationship status with Moira. I put them into a vase of water, even though I fear it might be too late. With a sad sigh, I picked up the bottle of whiskey Moira had given me as a get-well-soon gift. I'd planned to keep it for sentimental value, but after these last 2 weeks, I figured I deserved a drink. Falling asleep was easy, even with the itchy neck brace. I don't know if it was the whiskey or the last few sleepless nights I spent in that rigid, yet worn-out hospital bed, but I was exhausted. So tired that I even felt groggy during my dream, almost like the anesthetic the doctors gave me hadn't worn off yet. I guess it's my fault for mixing my pain medication with vintage. I should have known something was off the moment I got home, but exhaustion has a way of dulling your instincts. The dream started like any other. I was drifting in that strange state between falling asleep and clinging to consciousness. Of course, I know now that I must have been asleep and dreaming, because there's no logical explanation for what happened next. The room was silent as any other night outside the city. My eyes were closed and I could almost convince myself I was asleep, but then I heard it. It was faint but unmistakable. The heavy silence was broken up by what I can only describe as the sound of fingers cracking or ligaments popping into place. My eyes shot open. Something was moving, crawling onto the mattress. I couldn't see it, not fully. At this point, it was merely a suggestion of motion in my periphery. That's when I felt it, a slow, calculated weight shifting closer from the foot of my bed. I was begging every muscle in my body to allow me to sit up and turn on the light. Not a single one listened to my plea. The only thing I could move was my eyes. I looked down, as far down as my eyes would allow. I tried to lift my head, but if the paralysis wasn't enough to keep me anchored, the neck brace made sure of it. It was hopeless. I could feel the pressure building in my throat, making it almost impossible to breathe. The popping noise faded, replaced by the relentless pounding of my heartbeat, hammering against my eardrums as if desperate to escape. All the while, the silhouette was inching closer, the weight carefully shifting on the mattress. The shape was hovering over me, making sure not to touch me. My breathing was rapid and uncontrollable, and my heartbeat was growing louder. So, I did the only thing I could in that situation. I used the only part of my body I still had control over, my eyes. I shut them with the same force I had opened them when I first heard that dreadful noise. The instant I closed my eyes, everything went quiet. All movement stopped, and my mattress was suddenly as stiff as the hospital bed I had grown accustomed to. It was all inside my head, I thought. It's just a bad dream. Keep your eyes closed and focus on falling asleep. This will all be over when you wake up. I laid there for what felt like hours, but realistically, it was just a few minutes. All I could do was wait. Wait for sleep or wait for my body to finally respond. I'm not a patient man, and I never have been, but after what I saw last night, I will never even complain about a red light ever again. I wish I had kept my eyes closed, but against my better judgment, I slowly opened them, my eyes adjusting to the darkness all too easily. Then I saw it, its face only a few centimeters from mine. The skin was smooth and pale, cracked like a porcelain doll, and stretched too tightly over the ridges of its face. But it was the eyes that held me in place. A row of 8 black pearls that tapered out to the sides, the largest of which was a pair placed right in the middle. Easily distinguishable by the glint of light collected in them, like pools of ink sucking up the last bit of light from the room. The time for screaming had long passed. All I could do was stare. I didn't even bother attempting to move anymore. For all I knew, my paralysis had worn off, but I didn't care. Its gaze was unblinking, relentless, consuming. The darkness inside those eyes seemed to ripple, as though something moved just beneath. The sharp reflection of the room was mirrored in their glossy surfaces. The longer I stared, the more the room's reflection fell out of focus, and I could feel myself slipping further into pure darkness. I was falling down a well and unraveling like a poorly made basket, drifting into the void. The next thing I remember is waking up, expecting the usual soft morning light to seep through my paper-thin curtains, gradually brightening the room. Instead, the harsh midday sun spilled in unapologetically. Still, it was a welcome change from the unforgiving darkness of the previous night. I glanced at my alarm clock but couldn't see the time. Slowly, I turned my stiff body and clumsily reached over, knocking the half-empty whiskey bottle out of the way. It was almost 3 p.m., still half asleep. I stumbled out of my room into the hallway. At first, I thought the old, stained wallpaper had little square patches of new wallpaper stuck over it. Then I noticed the wooden floorboards were scattered with broken glass and fallen picture frames. I didn't bother picking up all of them, but one caught my attention. When I took it out of the broken frame, I saw myself and my grandmother standing in front of an old house in the woods. I was just a child. Beside us were 2 unfamiliar faces, a man and a woman. An aunt and uncle, family friends, my parents. Why can't I remember what happened to them? Memories swam around in my head, but none pertained to my parents. I was starving by this point, so I figured I'd save time and make breakfast, lunch, and dinner all at once, which just meant pouring a comically large bowl of cereal. Now I'm sitting at my dining room table, spoon in one hand and the other on my keyboard, writing down what I remember from last night's dream. All the while, I was thinking of the photograph next to my laptop. The old picture patiently resting on the polished surface of my grandmother's vintage table. I slid it closer, shifting my focus from the 2 strangers. I instead studied the background. A brand new tire swing hung from an old tree. And the house. I couldn't quite place it, but I knew I had been there as a kid. Strangely, recalling details from the picture felt harder than remembering a dream. On a different note, I once read something online about Chinese water torture. Don't ask me why I remember this, but not my childhood. Memories are strange like that. Anyway, it's a method where drops of water are slowly dripped onto a person's head at irregular intervals. The randomness of the dripping can lead to psychological effects since the victim can't anticipate when the next drop will fall. Over time, this can lead to anxiety, stress, and even hallucinations. About halfway through writing this entry, I started feeling a faint, inconsistent dripping coming from the ceiling above me. I'd describe the source, but that would require me to get up, take almost 4 steps back, and painfully crane my head far enough back to even see the ceiling. It's too much effort for what I already know is just a leak. I've tried moving seats 3 times, but the dripping seems to follow me wherever I sit. Then it happened. After finishing my cereal and absent-mindedly twirling my spoon, I swear I saw something. On the glossy surface of the spoon, a flash of movement caught my eye, a large shape skittering across the ceiling behind me. It moved like a shadow, but its color was a pale white. I saw it only for a second. It was swift and fleeting, but its form was unmistakable. A spider, bigger than a person, its 8 legs pushing and pulling it out of the room in one smooth, coordinated motion. I almost jumped out of my skin. I spun around as fast as I could, whipping my head back. The pain was immense, shooting through me like lightning striking the back of my neck. In my frantic attempt to look at the ceiling, I found myself on my hands and knees, staring at the floor. Slowly, I pulled myself back onto the chair. I was lightheaded, on the verge of fainting. I jumped at every black spot in my vision. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It was then that I recalled reading about water torture and how it can cause hallucinations, which, oddly, gave me some comfort. At least now the dripping has stopped. I'll post all I have written so far for part 2. I can't bear to sit here and write another word. Not after what I just saw. I think I'll message Joshua to come over. I can't be alone right now. I'll keep you guys updated if anything else happens. Expect another part soon.